Grace Coleman had scrubbed the marble floors of the Ashcroft penthouse for 11 months before she ever spoke a full sentence to the man who owned it. She knew his coffee order: black, no sugar, made at exactly 6:40 in the morning, and left on the tray outside his study door, never inside it, because he did not like to be watched while he worked. She knew which side of the bed he did not sleep in, because the housekeeper had told her once, in a low voice, that it had belonged to his mother during the last year of her illness, and that Mr. Weston Hale had never once, in 9 years, allowed anyone to move the small reading lamp on that side. She knew the sound of his footsteps at midnight, slow and even, pacing the long hallway outside the library, when a deal had gone wrong. She did not know his face well. She had learned, the way all the staff learned, to keep her eyes down and her voice quiet, and her presence so unremarkable that a man could walk past her in his own hallway 40 times and still not be able to describe her hair color afterward. She was 24. She had been raised in a group home in Ohio after her mother died of a fever no one had caught in time, and she had come to the city at 19 with 2 suitcases and a recommendation letter from a woman who ran the home and who had loved her, in the brisk, unshowy way that overworked women loved the children they could not keep. Grace had cleaned hotel rooms, then office buildings, then, through a housekeeping agency with a good reputation, she had been placed in the Hale residence, a 42nd floor penthouse above the financial district, with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the harbor that she was not, in 11 months, ever once given the leisure to properly look at. She was not unhappy. She wanted to be clear about that later, when people asked her, and people would ask her, for the rest of her life, how it had happened, how a housekeeper's assistant had ended up at the head of the Hale table. She was not unhappy in the penthouse. The pay was steady. The head housekeeper, a warm, broad woman named Dolores Ferreira, treated her staff like family and kept a jar of peppermints on the kitchen counter that she pretended not to notice the junior staff taking. Grace had a small apartment in Queens with a window box she had planted with basil that never quite thrived in the light. She sang sometimes while she polished the silver very softly, old hymns her mother used to hum, and she did not know that this was the first thing Weston Hale ever noticed about her, 3 months before he ever learned her name. He noticed her voice before he noticed her face. He was 34, the CEO of Hale Maritime Logistics, a company his grandfather had built from 2 tugboats in 1961, and that Weston had, in the 6 years since his father's death, turned into the largest private shipping concern on the eastern seaboard. He was, by every account that appeared in the business press, a cold man, efficient, unmarried, photographed rarely, and never smiling in the photographs that existed. He had buried his mother at 19 and his father at 28, and somewhere in the burying, he had developed the particular quiet of a man who had decided, long ago, that the fewer things he allowed himself to want, the fewer things could be taken from him. He came home one evening in February, later than usual, after a board meeting that had run 4 hours over its scheduled time and ended in a shouting match with his uncle Desmond, who sat on the board and who had never forgiven Weston for being the son his own brother had chosen to leave the company to, instead of him. Weston let himself into the penthouse through the service hallway, a habit from childhood, because the front elevator required small talk with the doorman, and he did not, that night, have any small talk left in him. He heard the singing before he saw her. It was coming from the kitchen, low, unhurried, a little off-key in a way that was somehow more affecting than perfect pitch would have been, and it was the first sound in that apartment in longer than he could remember that was not a phone ringing, or a market alert chiming, or his own footsteps on marble. He stood in the hallway, outside the kitchen door, for almost a full minute before he went in. He told himself afterward that he had simply been tired and had stopped to loosen his tie. He did not examine, that night, or for several weeks after, why he had stood there, listening, instead of walking past. She startled when she saw him, nearly dropping the silver tray she was polishing, and said, quickly, "Mr. Hale, I'm sorry, I didn't hear the elevator." And he said, I came up the service stairs, and then, because he did not know what else to say to a woman whose name he did not know, but whose voice he had just spent a minute listening to in his own hallway, he asked her what the song was. "It's just an old hymn," she said. "My mother used to sing it. I'm sorry if it disturbed you." "It didn't," he said. And then, because it was true, and he did not often say true things out loud, it was the first good thing that's happened today. She did not know what to do with that. Neither did he. He went to his study, and did not come out until well past midnight, and Grace went home to Queens, and did not think very much more about it, because a tired man saying one kind sentence was not, in her experience, a thing worth building an evening's thoughts around. Rich men said many things. She had learned, working in houses like this one, that the things rich men said in passing rarely meant what they would have meant from anyone else, and she had trained herself, for her own protection, not to hold on to them. But Weston Hale held on to it. He found himself, over the following weeks, arriving home a little earlier than he needed to, and staying a little longer in the hallway outside the kitchen before he announced himself. He learned, without asking anyone directly, that her name was Grace. He learned it from Dolores, who mentioned it once in passing. "Grace, dear, could you bring up the linens?" And he filed the name away the way he filed away shipping manifests. Exactly, permanently, without meaning to. He was, by nature, not an impulsive man. He built ships and moved cargo across oceans on 18-month timelines, and did not believe in doing anything quickly that could be done carefully instead. So when he began to notice that he was thinking about a member of his own household staff, her quiet efficiency, the way she left a small folded note under his coffee cup some mornings with the weather forecast written out in a neat, plain hand because she had once overheard him complain to his assistant that he never checked it before leaving for meetings, the way she was kind to the newest and youngest maid on staff, a nervous 17-year-old named Priya, in a way that cost her nothing but clearly mattered. He did not act on it. He watched it. He turned it over the way he turned over a difficult contract, looking for the flaw in it, waiting for the moment it would reveal itself to be less than it seemed. It never did. That, in the end, was what undid him. The turn came in April, on a night that had nothing romantic about it at all, which Grace would later say was exactly why she believed, afterward, that whatever had happened between them was real. Weston came home from a dinner with the Larkspur Group, a Norwegian shipping conglomerate he had spent 8 months courting for a merger that would double his company's Atlantic fleet, in a mood so foul that Dolores took one look at his face in the elevator camera feed and told the rest of the staff to make themselves scarce for the evening. Grace had not gotten the message in time. She was in the library, returning a set of ledgers to the shelf where his late father had kept them, a small and unremarkable task that had simply taken her longer than expected, when Weston came in and threw his jacket over the back of a chair with more force than the jacket deserved. "Leave it," he said, not looking at her. "Whatever it is, leave it and go home." She should have. She knew, even as she stayed, that she should have simply said, "Yes, sir," and gone. But something in his voice, not the anger in it, but the thing underneath the anger, which she recognized because she had heard it in her own voice more than once in her life, made her stop at the door instead of going through it. "You've had a bad night," she said. It was not a question. He turned. He looked, for a moment, genuinely surprised that she had spoken at all, and then something in his face went very tired, the way a man's face goes when he has been holding a particular posture for so long that he has forgotten there is another way to stand. "The Larkspur deal is dead," he said. 8 months. "My uncle told the board tonight that he'd rather see the company sold than see me run it into the ground with, and I quote, sentimental overreach. He's not entirely wrong. I pushed too hard on the timeline. I wanted it done by my father's birthday. That's not a business reason. That's not anything a board should have to hear." He said this to her, to a housekeeper, in the middle of his own library, at 11 at night, the way a man says something he has been carrying alone for a long time, and has simply run out of room to keep carrying it. Grace understood, standing there, that he was not really talking to her. He was talking to the first person in the room who had not asked him for anything. "My mother used to say," Grace said carefully, "that wanting to finish something for someone you loved wasn't sentimental. She said it was the only kind of ambition worth having. The other kind runs out. That kind doesn't." He looked at her for a long moment. The library was very quiet. Outside the tall windows, the harbor lights were small and orange and endless. "What was her name?" he asked. "Your mother." "Adele," Grace said. "She cleaned houses too, bigger ones than this, in a smaller town. She used to say the house always tells you the truth about the people in it, even when the people don't. And what does this house tell you?" Grace considered this seriously, the way she considered most things, because she did not have the kind of life that allowed for careless answers. "That somebody built it with a lot of love in it," she said, "and somebody's been living in it alone for a long time since." Weston did not say anything for a while. Then he asked her to sit down, which was not a thing an employer asked of household staff, and which she should have declined, and did not. They talked for 2 hours that night, not about the company, after the first 10 minutes, about small things, the group home in Ohio, the woman who ran it, the basil that would not grow in her queen's window, about his mother's reading lamp, which he told her about for the first time in 9 years, the fact that no one was allowed to move it, the fact that he had never told anyone why, about the ships his grandfather had started with, the names of the 2 tugboats, the Miriam and the Constance, after his grandfather's mother and sister. Grace listened the way she had always listened, fully, without performing interest, and Weston Hale, who had spent 6 years being listened to only by people who wanted something from him, found that he did not want the conversation to end. It ended anyway, because it had to. She said, near 1 in the morning, that she should go, and he walked her to the service elevator himself, which he had never done for any member of the staff in 9 years of living in that building. And at the elevator he said, "Grace," using her name for the first time out loud, and she looked up at him, and he did not finish the sentence. He only said, "Thank you for staying tonight," and she said, "Good night, Mr. Hale," and the doors closed between them, and neither of them slept very much that night, for entirely different reasons that were, underneath, the same reason. What happened over the following 2 months was not, Grace would later insist, a courtship. It was smaller and slower than that, made almost entirely of the kind of moments no one else in the building noticed. He began leaving his study door open a little when he worked late, which she understood, without being told, as an invitation to knock if she wanted to. She began leaving him small things along with his morning coffee, not just the weather now, but sometimes a line from a book she'd read, sometimes nothing at all but a coffee made exactly right, which had somehow become its own kind of message between them. He noticed, once, that she had been limping slightly for 3 days, and insisted, over her protests, that the company doctor see her ankle, and stood in the hallway outside the exam room the entire time, in a way that made Dolores, watching from the kitchen, raise her eyebrows very high and say nothing to anyone. He never touched her hand in those 2 months. He never said anything that could not, if repeated to a lawyer or a board member, be explained away as ordinary decency. But Grace understood, the way a person understands weather changing before the first drop of rain falls, that something had shifted in the house, and that everyone in it, Dolores, Priya, the doorman, even the driver, had begun to understand it too, long before either she or Weston said a word about it to each other directly. The trouble, when it came from outside the house, the way trouble in stories like this one usually does. Her name was Vanessa Kirkland, and she had been, for the better part of a year, before Grace ever set foot in the Hale penthouse, the woman most of the financial press assumed Weston Hale would eventually marry. She was the daughter of a shipping insurance magnate, whose company had underwritten half of Hale Maritime's fleet for 3 generations, and the match between the 2 families had been discussed at boardroom dinners with the same casual certainty that people discuss whether they consider inevitable. Weston had taken her to 4 galas in 2 years. He had never proposed, never quite let the relationship become anything more than a convenient public arrangement that kept both families' lawyers satisfied and both families' mothers, his own long dead, hers very much alive and very insistent, pleased. Vanessa had assumed, not unreasonably, that this was simply how Weston Hale loved, carefully, at a distance, on a long enough timeline that eventually it would become official because it had never become anything else. She found out about Grace at a spring benefit for the Maritime Historical Society, an event Weston attended every year because his grandfather's name was on a wing of the museum, and which he had, this particular year, attended alone and left early, which was unlike him. Vanessa, who had spies in every household that mattered in the city, the way other women had book clubs, heard from her own family's driver, who was friendly with the Hale building's doorman, that Mr. Hale had been seen more than once walking a member of his household staff to her car personally, and that the staff called the young woman Miss Grace, now instead of by her surname, which was, among the old money families Vanessa had grown up in, a signal understood by everyone and spoken of by no one. Vanessa did not confront Weston directly. She was too well trained for that. Instead, she arranged, through her mother, to be invited to a small dinner at the Hale penthouse, the kind of dinner families like theirs had held for generations, ostensibly social, actually a negotiation, and she made certain, before she arrived, that she knew exactly who Grace Coleman was, where she had come from, and precisely how to make that origin sound, in a room full of the city's oldest families, like a scandal, rather than a simple fact of a woman's life. The dinner took place on a Friday evening in June. Weston had not wanted it. His uncle Desmond had arranged it without asking him, using the pretext of smoothing over the Larkspur fallout with a show of family stability. And Weston, still weeks away from being able to refuse his uncle anything without reigniting the boardroom war he'd only just quieted, had agreed to it with the flat, resigned courtesy of a man doing something he knew was a mistake, because the alternative cost more than he was willing to pay yet. Grace was on staff that night, of course. She was not meant to be seen, only to move quietly at the edges of the room, the way household staff, at dinners like this one, were trained to move, refilling glasses, clearing plates, present and invisible at once. She had done this 100 times. She had never done it while the man at the head of the table kept finding her eyes across the room, or while the woman seated at his right hand watched him do it with an expression of controlled, waiting patience that Grace, without knowing anything about Vanessa Kirkland yet, recognized immediately as dangerous. It happened over dessert. Vanessa waited for a lull in the table conversation. She was too skilled to force the moment. She simply created the space for it and let someone else walk in, and then she said, in a voice pitched just loud enough to carry the length of the table, "Weston, darling, I have to say, your household has such an interesting mix of people lately. Dolores mentioned your newest girl came up through the foster system. Ohio, was it? It's really quite admirable, taking on staff like that. So few families are willing to." The table went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet, when everyone present understands they have just watched a knife go in, even if they could not all see the blade. Grace, standing near the sideboard with a water pitcher in her hand, did not move. She had spent her entire adult life absorbing comments like this one, without letting her face show what they cost her, and she did not let it show now. But Weston set down his fork. "Her name is Grace Coleman," he said, in a voice that was very quiet and very even, the voice Grace had come to recognize as the one he used in the boardroom, right before he ended someone's argument permanently. She grew up in a group home because her mother died young, which is not a scandal, Vanessa. It's a fact of her life, the same as it's a fact of mine, that my father died and left me a company I wasn't ready for at 28. I don't recall either of us being asked to apologize for our facts at this table before tonight. "I only meant—" "I know what you meant," Weston said. "I'd like you to stop meaning it in my home." Desmond, at the far end of the table, cleared his throat, and attempted, with the practiced smoothness of a man who had spent his career papering over other people's honesty, to redirect the conversation toward the Historical Society's new acquisitions. It did not work. Vanessa's face had gone very pale and very still, and she excused herself shortly after, with a grace that Grace herself, watching from the sideboard, found herself almost admiring, even as her own hands were shaking around the water pitcher. What Grace did not see, because she had stepped out to the kitchen the moment the dessert plates were cleared, was what happened after. Vanessa, in the front hallway, waiting for her coat, turned to Weston, who had walked her out himself, out of an old-fashioned courtesy that had nothing to do with affection and everything to do with not wanting Desmond to have another thing to complain about, and said, quietly, without the audience of the dinner table to perform for, "You're in love with her." "That's not your business, Vanessa." "It is, actually, since half the city has spent 2 years assuming we'd marry. I'd like to know before I read it in a column." Weston was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the particular honesty of a man who has just realized a true thing at the exact moment he is saying it out loud, "I think I might be. I hadn't let myself say that yet. Thank you for making me say it to you first. I suppose that's the closest thing to a favor I owe you." Vanessa's mouth twisted, not unkindly, into something that was almost a real smile. "Well," she said, "I hope she's worth what my mother is about to put you through. Good night, Weston." She left and did not come back, and to her credit, a credit Grace would only learn about much later, when the two women had, improbably, become something like friends, Vanessa never spoke a word against Grace to the press or to her own social circle again, though the same could not be said for her mother. The public part of the story, the part that eventually made the newspapers, began the following week, when a photograph surfaced of Weston Hale and a young woman, later identified only as a member of the Hale household staff, walking together, unremarkably, along the harbour promenade on a Sunday evening. Neither of them had noticed the photographer. They had simply been walking, the way they had begun walking most Sundays that Grace had off, because Weston had discovered, somewhere in the 2 months since the library conversation, that he preferred the harbour with her beside him to the harbour alone, which he had walked for years and never once thought to describe, even privately, as lonely, until he had something to compare it to. The story broke ugly, as these stories tend to. A gossip column ran it first, under a headline that used the word Cinderella with a sneer instead of affection, and Desmond Hale, who had been waiting for exactly this kind of ammunition since the moment his brother's will was read 6 years earlier, called an emergency session of the board. Grace found out about the board meeting the same way she found out most things about Weston's professional life, second-hand, from Dolores, who had heard it from Margareta, Weston's assistant, who had spent the morning fielding calls from 4 different news outlets asking for comment on the CEO's relationship with a domestic employee. Grace read the column herself, standing in the small kitchen of her Queen's apartment before her shift, and felt something in her chest go very cold and very still, the particular stillness of a person deciding, in real time, to protect someone else from a cost she is not willing to let them pay. She did not go to work that day. She wrote Weston a letter instead, by hand, because she did not have his private number and would not have used it if she had, and because some things, she felt, needed to be said in a form that could be reread and could not be shouted over. "Mr. Hale, I am writing to resign my position, effective immediately, and to ask that you not attempt to change my mind. I have read what is being written about us, and I understand, better than most people would, exactly what it costs a man like you to be associated with a woman like me in the newspapers your board reads at breakfast. I grew up watching people like your uncle decide, without ever meeting me, exactly what I was worth, and I have spent my whole life being underestimated by rooms I was never given a real seat in. I will not be the reason you lose the company your grandfather built, with 2 tugboats and a lot of love. I care about you too much for that, which I suppose is the first time I have written that sentence to anyone, and possibly the last time, I will let myself write it, because I think it is kinder to both of us if I go now, before it costs you something you cannot get back. Please tell Dolores I am sorry to leave her short-staffed, and please give Priya my address. I promised I would help her study for her GED, and I meant it. Thank you for the 2 hours in the library in April. I will keep them, whatever else happens. Grace. She left the letter with the doorman, along with her staff keycard, and went home, and did not answer her phone when it began ringing 40 minutes later, because she did not trust herself, yet, to hear his voice, and hold to what she had decided. Weston read the letter standing in his own front hallway, in front of Margareta and 2 members of the board who had come by, unannounced, to discuss optics before the emergency session that afternoon. He read it twice. Then he folded it, put it in his jacket pocket, and said to the 2 board members, in a voice that Margareta would later describe to Dolores as the calmest she had ever heard him sound, while also being, unmistakably, furious. "Gentlemen, I'll see you at the board meeting. I have somewhere to be first." The board meeting that afternoon was, by every account of the 6 people present for it, the shortest and most consequential in Hale Maritime's 63-year history. Weston arrived 11 minutes late, which he had never in 6 years as CEO done before, and Desmond, sensing weakness where there was none, opened with a prepared statement about reputational risk and the optics of impropriety, and a suggestion, thinly veiled as a recommendation, that the board consider whether Weston's judgment, evidenced, he said, by both the collapsed Larkspur deal and now this, merited a formal review of his position. Weston let him finish. Then he stood, and he did not raise his voice, because he had learned a long time ago that a man who has to raise his voice in a boardroom has already lost the room, and he said the following, which 3 separate board members would later, off the record, describe to different reporters, almost word for word, because it was the kind of thing said once in a room that everyone in the room remembers exactly. "My grandfather started this company with 2 boats and no family name behind him at all," Weston said. "He named them after his mother and his sister because they were the only people who believed a poor man from the docks could build something that would last 60 years. My father grew this company because he never once let anyone in a room like this one tell him that where a person came from was the same thing as what they were worth. I have spent 6 years running this company by the same principle, and I have made this company more money in those 6 years than it made in the 20 before them, and not one of you has ever once, until this week, questioned my judgment on the basis of anything but results. The woman you are discussing right now is not a scandal. She is the finest person I have met in my adult life, and she just resigned from my household this morning and asked me not to fight for her, because she was more worried about protecting this company than half the people in this room have ever been. I am not going to accept her resignation, and I am not going to sit on a board with anyone who thinks the size of a person's childhood bank account tells you anything true about the size of their character. Desmond, if you'd like to call a vote on my leadership, call it now. I'll wait." No one called a vote. Desmond, for the first time in 6 years, did not say anything at all, and the meeting ended 9 minutes after it began. Weston found Grace not at her apartment. She had, guessing correctly that he would come there first, gone instead to the small non-denominational chapel 2 blocks from her building, the one she went to on hard days. Not because she was especially religious, but because it was quiet and no one asked her questions there. But he found her eventually, near evening, sitting on a bench in the small park beside it, and he sat down next to her without asking, the way he had learned to sit next to her in the library on the night none of this had started, or perhaps had started exactly there. "You didn't have to come," Grace said, not looking at him. "I know," Weston said. "I wanted to anyway. That's usually how it works, I've found, with the things that actually matter. I meant what I wrote. I won't be the reason you lose the company." "You won't be," he said. "I told the board this afternoon that I'd rather lose the company than lose you, and then, because apparently the universe has a sense of humor. I didn't have to choose, because it turns out the board mostly agreed with me once someone finally said it out loud in the room. Desmond's the only one who didn't, and Desmond's been looking for a reason to hate me since before you were born, so I wouldn't take his opinion as the final word on your worth, Grace. I never have. She was quiet for a long moment. The park was small and unremarkable. A few benches and a struggling maple tree, and the sound of traffic 2 streets over. Nothing at all like the harbour promenade or the library or any of the places their 2 months had happened in. And Grace would think, later, that this was exactly right, that it should have happened somewhere ordinary, because nothing about what she felt for him had ever been about the penthouse or the money or any of the things a stranger would assume a story like theirs was about. "I've spent my whole life being the person no one really looks at," she said finally. "I got good at it. It felt safer that way. And then you looked at me, in that library, and I didn't know what to do with it, because nobody had ever really wanted to see the whole of me before. They either wanted the work I could do, or they wanted to feel generous for noticing me at all. I don't know how to be looked at the way you look at me, Weston. I'm scared of it, if I'm honest, because it means there's something to lose now that I didn't have to lose before." "I know exactly what that's like," he said. "I've spent 6 years deciding that the fewer things I wanted, the fewer things could be taken away. And it worked, mostly, except it meant I was alone in a 42nd floor apartment that had every single thing money could buy in it, and none of the one thing that actually mattered. Then I heard someone singing an old hymn in my own kitchen, off-key, like she didn't care if anyone heard, and it was the first honest sound that apartment had made in 9 years. I'm not going to pretend I know exactly how to do this either, Grace. I'm asking you to figure it out with me instead of alone, which is, I think, the whole of what I actually want. Not a housekeeper, not a headline, just you, in the kitchen, whether you're singing or not, for as long as you'll have me there to hear it." Grace looked at him for a long moment, the way she looked at most things, seriously, without performing anything for him, which was, she would tell people later, exactly the reason he had noticed her in the first place, and exactly the reason none of what followed ever felt to either of them like it had been won through trying. "I never once tried to make any of this happen," she said quietly. "I want you to know that. I wasn't scheming for a rich man in my own kitchen. I was just being who I was." "I know," Weston said. "That's the entire reason it worked." They married the following spring, on the harbour promenade at sunset, the same walk where the photograph that started the scandal had been taken, because Grace had insisted, gently, that she was not interested in erasing where the story had actually happened, in favour of somewhere more impressive. Dolores cried through the whole ceremony and denied it fiercely for years afterward. Priya, 17 no longer, but 19, and midway through a nursing degree Grace had quietly helped fund, stood as one of 2 bridesmaids, the other being, to the great surprise of the assembled guests and the great satisfaction of Grace herself, Vanessa Kirkland, who had written Grace a short, honest letter of apology 8 months earlier, and had, in the strange way that former rivals sometimes do, become one of the people Grace trusted most in the world of old money she had married into, but never quite belonged to, and, in the end, never needed to. Desmond did not attend. He sold his shares in Hale Maritime 11 months later, at a price several analysts called generous, and moved to Florida, and was not, by anyone's account, much missed. Weston's mother's reading lamp still sits on the left side of the bed in the penthouse, unmoved, and Grace, who understood the first time he told her about it, exactly what it meant, and exactly why it should never be touched, has never once suggested otherwise. She still sings, sometimes, in the kitchen, off-key, old hymns her mother used to hum, and Weston Hale, who built ships and moved cargo across oceans, and once believed the fewer things he wanted, the safer he would be, has never once in all the years since stopped what he was doing to listen. The end.